Manufacturers have been a big part of Formula One since the very beginning, with their almost bottomless supplies of cash, their ability to hire all the best drivers, and then the expectation rather than the hope that they'll be towards the front of the grid. Ferrari, Mercedes, Maserati, Alfa Romeo, Toyota, BMW, Honda, you name a manufacturer and chances are they've been involved in Formula One at some point. Even Subaru. They tried to revive the flat 12 concept with the Coloni team in the early 90s and it went badly. The early 2000s are considered to be the peak of the manufacturer involvement, as the bigger teams who were not strictly manufacturers like McLaren, Williams and British American Racing teamed up with the likes of Mercedes, BMW and Honda, while Sauber had its existing relationship with Ferrari, while Arrows, Prost, Minardi and Jordan either sold up or disappeared completely. But there's one manufacturer there that I didn't mention that you're probably about to hit your keyboards and go, but you forgot. I didn't forget, and that's because we're about to mention them now because that's what this video is going to be about. Renault. Their in-out love-hate relationship, at least it seems, with Formula One, and the fact that if the rumours are to be believed, Renault, Alpine, could end up losing its own engine supply. If that's even possible. Might as well address those rumours now. Alpine is rumoured to be offloading the team with two potential buyers being Andretti or even the Geely Group that owns the likes of Volvo, Polestar, Lotus and others. Renault boss Luca De Meo is adamant that the team won't be sold at all despite the current lack of success on track. Renault, in turn, is thinking of pulling out of the development of the 2026 engine regulations because Renault considers them to be too high, or at least selling the engine development part of the company to someone who is prepared to spray money up the walls to get something built. So it seems the total opposite from the Renault of the late 1970s that was quite prepared to spray money up the walls to be at the cutting edge of the sport. The Yellow Teapot, the first Renault Formula One car. This car started the turbo age in Formula One, turning up with a 1.5 litre turbocharged V6 engine, something that sounds perfectly normal today, but back then this was a game changer, especially since everybody else had a naturally aspirated engine that ran 8, 10 or even 12 cylinders. But it wasn't a success because it was woefully unreliable. It didn't even start the season, not turning up until the British Grand Prix despite the proposed debut being the French Grand Prix of 1977. It was also slow. Jean-Pierre Jabouille was about 1.62 seconds behind James Hunt, who was on pole, which is actually not a bad deficit for the time, but he was down in 21st place, slowly making his way up to 16th before his turbo went kaput on lap 17. Renault would then miss the following two rounds in Germany and Austria before coming back for Zandvoort, where the performance improved. He would be 10th in qualifying and ran as high as 6th before the suspension went. Put simply, this car did not finish a single race in 1977. At the final race it entered in Canada, the car didn't even qualify. Renault, for the next few years, built what could only be described as glass cannons. The engines they had were incredibly powerful, but more often than not, they'd crap their pants in the race. The turbocharger they had on the car was made out of cast iron to be able to withstand the pressures involved, which made the car unnecessarily heavy in the process. The reason that 1977 car is called the Yellow Teapot isn't so much because of how it looked, but because of the fact it was quite often found with white smoke or steam coming out the back of it. It took 2 years for Renault to identify the problems with the engine and start to increase the reliability. The problem was building an engine that was light enough out of lightweight materials such as aluminium and whatever else they could get their hands on, which could also withstand the pressure of the air being shoved into the engine. At the same time, the other teams and manufacturers started looking at what Renault was doing because a smaller engine would, in theory, work better with the other revolution that was going on at the time. Ground effect. Story goes that Mr. Ferrari initially wanted the FIA to ban ground effect because he wouldn't give up his beloved flat 12s. Lotus and the others that were still using smaller engines such as the DFV were content to keep ground effect because the smaller footprint of the DFV allowed for the maximisation of the Venturi tunnels that ran along the sides of the cars. Renault, using an engine that was half the size, would mean that their ground effect systems could be maximised even further, but the other teams were wary given that the turbos were still unreliable. By 1979, Renault had solved some of the problems. The engine was now lighter, stronger, a little bit more reliable, but was still prone to being thirsty and also prone to overheating. But also in that 1979 season, they won their first race, the first for a turbo, and that was at the 1979 French Grand Prix. The last time a car with some sort of forced induction had won a race was Fangio in an Alfa back in 1951. Since then, turbocharging or supercharging wasn't really done for the reasons of weight and fuel consumption, and supercharging was banned in 1961 when the FIA dropped the maximum engine capacity to 1.5 litres. At Monaco in 1979, Renault fitted another turbo to the engine, which allowed for Jabouille and the newly appointed second driver in René Arnoux to have way more power and a bit of reduced turbo lag, but the cars still wanted to break down. I think it was this season that one of the cars went through 3 engines in one practice session. There should have been a race in Sweden between the Monaco and French Grand Prix, but that race was cancelled, so it left Renault about a month with which to get things fixed. Sort of. On home turf, Jabouille got his second pole of the year, having already been on pole at Kyalami, where the turbo had an advantage over everybody else because the track was at high altitude. And then the stars must have aligned, because both cars made it to the end of a Grand Prix. Before this, Jabouille had only finished 4 races given the unreliability of the turbo. But the fact that Jabouille won this race is often overshadowed by the fact that René Arnoux and Gilles Villeneuve were battling for second place and kicking 7 colours of shit out of each other in the process. So Jabouille won the first ever race for a turbo engine and the first ever race for Renault in Formula 1, but all anybody remembers was the battle for second. 1979 was a marked improvement on 77 and 78. The Renault engine managed to take a second place at the following British Grand Prix and another second place at the final round at Watkins Glen, proving that as long as it worked, it would be a competitive engine. Seeing that this was the case, Honda, Ferrari and BMW began looking at developing their own turbochargers, with the turbo revolution really beginning around 1983 or so, especially when Harvey Postlethwaite at Tyrrell noticed that the Renaults were regularly 20 miles an hour faster than everybody else in the speed traps at Dijon. It was in 1983 that Renault would start supplying customer engines to other teams. The first of these was Lotus, who was struggling in the immediate aftermath of the death of their team founder, leader and visionary, Colin Chapman. Brabham and Ferrari were also powered by turbo engines at this point, and Piquet narrowly won the title from Prost, who looked set to win the title if not for some typical Renault turbo unreliability. Prost was then sacked at the end of the season for criticising the team. After Prost departed for McLaren, results dropped off, but the team could still score points. The problem was they were routinely being beaten by Lotus, who were using customer engines through 84 and 85. So at the end of the 85 season, Renault withdrew the team, but kept supplying until the end of 86. Renault would be gone after achieving 5 wins and 19 pole positions with the customer engines, but then in 1989, just 3 years after they'd originally left, they were back. The turbos were gone and were now in the naturally aspirated 3.5 litre era. Renault was initially the only manufacturer on the grid to have a V10 with pneumatic valve springs, which had initially debuted in the engine supplied to the Lotus 98T we looked at a couple of days ago. Honda were also supplying a V10 to McLaren, but it didn't have the pneumatic valves that the RS1 had, and the RS1 would be fitted to the Williams cars in 1989. Renault would take just 2 wins that year as Senna and Prost in the Honda-powered McLarens went on to win the championship. By 1991 though, Williams and Renault had managed to shrink the gap to McLaren. Williams at this time was experimenting with things like the traction control and other bits and pieces that would in turn cause some glitches and retirements, but it was now clear that Renault was on the way up. The Renault engine by the end of 1991 was considered to be the best all-rounder and could be considered part of the reason the other teams and manufacturers went the route of V10 as opposed to the more frugal V8s and the more thirsty V12s. It was that in-between balance of power and thirst, and if built right, it could be light enough too. The RS3 used by Williams in 1991 had around 700 horsepower at 12,500 RPM, so about 20-ish down on the Honda, but could still run it pretty close, especially given the lighter overall construction and the aerodynamic and technological advancements on the FW14. But by 1992, the Renault engine would be the engine to have. Sure, it was still down on power versus the Honda V12 that Senna had at McLaren, but the drivability of the engine was better. It was lighter as well, and yes, there was the active suspension and other stuff on the car that allowed Mansell to take full advantage. It meant that between 1992 and 1997, Renault would win 6 constructors' titles in a row, 92 to 94 with Williams, 95 with Benetton, and then 96 and 97 again with Williams. 64 wins for Renault Power in 6 years, in an era where seasons were 16 races long, usually. In 1995, Renault had added a fly-by-wire throttle to the engines that helped give it yet another edge over the competition. But in the latter part of the 1996 season, Williams and Benetton would be looking for new engine suppliers because Renault was going to be withdrawing from Formula 1. Basically, what had happened was the company had recently been privatised and the new shareholders weren't really keen on spending lots of money on Formula 1 projects. Williams and Benetton would be left with 1997 spec engines modified and tweaked by Mechachrome, but the problem was that Mercedes and Ferrari would be outspending and outdeveloping, with both manufacturers being able to surpass the Renault power into 1998. In addition, the fact that a lot of Benetton's key personnel had followed Schumacher to Ferrari at the start of 97 and Adrian Newey, the former Williams designer, was now at McLaren, so there'd been a notable shift in the teams at the top of the pecking order. Benetton and Williams went from being at the front challenging for wins to barely scraping onto the podium for the most part. Mechachrome basically paid Renault for the development work and the engines were effectively built under license, so they had Renault's blueprints and built them accordingly. The development ability was just not there. At the end of 1998, Mechachrome signed a deal with Supertech, which was one of Flavio Briatore's companies, to have Mechachrome build the engines and then Supertech be the distributor. These engines would end up being used by BAR, Williams, Arrows and Benetton at some point through 1999 and 2000. And we talked about this in one of the downfall episodes that I've done over the last sort of 12 months or so, is that Renault paid about 120 million to buy out Benetton because Renault was now interested in being back in the sport. Renault, much like it had been when it first came into Formula 1 in 1977, would be the exclusive user of its engines, presumably to get something that would be good enough to then sell to others. Renault rejoined just as the manufacturer era of Formula 1 was kicking off, as Ferrari, Mercedes, BMW, Ford, Honda, Toyota and Renault all had some sort of manufacturer interest in what was going on. As a result, engine development skyrocketed and the cost of the engines also skyrocketed. And this was part of the killing off of some of the privateer teams such as Arrows and Prost, with Jordan and Minardi barely clinging on before both teams were sold. It was also the beginning of the Schumacher dominance years, so Renault had some catching up to do. Despite Ferrari dominating, Renault had managed to finish a respectable 4th on return, as they rebranded Benetton to Renault and utterly battered the Ford, Honda and Toyota factory teams in the process. Then in 2003, in the hands of Fernando Alonso, a Renault engine would score the first victory since 1997. Alonso won the Hungarian Grand Prix, signalling that Renault still had something to give in this era that was more between Ferrari, BMW and Mercedes engine power. The Renault wasn't as powerful as the other 3 engines, but the overall package that Renault had was half decent, and Alonso scored 3 other podiums besides his win, and both him and Trulli were consistently in the points, with Alonso often knocking on the door of getting a podium. Once again, they would be 4th in the Constructors, but scored 88 points compared to the 23 they had in 2002. After enduring all those years of blown turbos and blown engines through the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Renault finally achieved what they wanted to do. As a constructor in Formula 1, they finally won the championship when Alonso would win in 2005, the final year of the V10s. The RS25 engine that Renault had that year had incredible drivability. Renault had been using a wide-angle V10 since 2001 that had so many vibration issues that they had to turn it down to help mitigate that, and also had to strengthen certain parts that ended up giving the car a weight distribution more towards the rear. And this actually helped with traction, but in 2005 Renault changed the design to be a 72-degree V configuration and then intentionally built the car to have more weight over the rear end, and also used a similar torque curve to what the 2001 engines had that also helped with the drivability. Maybe I need to do a full profile on the R25 because they did more than just beat Ferrari through the rules. And actually, saying that, in 2006, which was the first year of V8 engines, Alonso and Renault won the championship again, which kind of proved that it was more than just the rules, as it was in 2005, that is. So with the V8 era underway and Renault on for a second Constructors' Championship, they began seeing about supplying other teams. The first of these was Red Bull, who signed a supply deal with Renault in late 2006 to pick up some engines for 2007. Red Bull, then a midfield runner, managed to take full advantage of the 2009 rule set to be the championship contenders come the end of the year, but they were unable to outdevelop Brawn, who had a sizable advantage at the start of that year. Once again, Renault had been beaten by the customer team, thanks to some shuffling around which resulted in the Lotus Renault team in 2010, which later got taken over by Jenny Capital, which is all just a bit confusing. Renault joined up with Red Bull to become the sort of official engine supplier and engine partner for that particular team, and that's when the domination started again. Renault was once again partnered with Adrian Newey, much like they had been at Williams back in the 90s, and in doing so they were able to take more advantage of the modern technologies and some of the more forward-thinking ideas that Newey was able to come up with. In 2011, Newey asked Renault if it was possible to map the engines in a particular way. If Newey put the exhaust closer to the floor and had them pointing at the rear diffuser, then the exhaust gases would blow over the diffuser when on full throttle and generate a bit of extra downforce, something that had been done as early as the early 1990s. But Renault with Newey worked out a way of blowing the hot exhaust gases while off the throttle too, resulting in the blown diffusers that were quickly copied by everybody else, something those early 90s F1 cars weren't able to do, and made them quite twitchy under braking. Renault and Red Bull would win 4 consecutive drivers and constructors doubles between 2010 and 2013, before the hybrid era began and Mercedes became the dominant engine supplier. In early testing of those new hybrids, Renault was having problems with the turbos, déjà vu, and the systems harvesting the energy from the brakes to charge up the batteries. But compared to Mercedes and Ferrari, the power units were underpowered and unreliable, with Christian Horner publicly criticising Renault for building something that left them uncompetitive. With Renault returning to Formula 1 for 2016, buying out the almost doomed Lotus Formula 1 team, Red Bull renegotiated their engine supply, with also McLaren coming on board after their horrific time with Honda, and that started in 2018 in a bid to help Renault with the development of a better engine before Red Bull later switched to Honda Power. These days, Renault, now rebranded Alpine, is the only engine manufacturer on the grid that doesn't supply multiple teams. While the team scored a win with Esteban Ocon in 2021 and Gasly and Ocon scoring a podium last season, this season has been comparatively horrible. In recent races, the drivers have started scoring points, and things have moved forward as the team is now 7th in the Constructors' Championship on 8 points. Things behind the scenes, though, seem to be in constant turmoil. There have been management restructures recently, with Bob Bell going to Aston Martin to join up with Alonso. Now, though, it seems to be getting worse, as for 2026 the Alpine team might be losing Renault engines completely, as it looks like that Renault doesn't want to spend all of that money on these new engine regulations. It looks like Alpine will have to fish around for a supply deal as a customer team with another manufacturer. Red Bull was looking likely, but Horner said that because of the new deal with Ford, they don't want to stretch themselves out too early because they already have to supply both Red Bull and RB. But Mercedes power might be on the table as Aston Martin joins up with Honda on their return, but Honda could also be an option later if a deal with Mercedes falls through. So it looks like Renault has this weird in-out relationship with Formula 1. The days of unreliability and the blown turbos of the late 70s and the early 80s, through the glory years of the 90s to the 2 successful years they had in the mid-2000s, and now everything else that's going on now. It's weird that Renault has had so much success as a supplier, but not that much as an actual team. Now, back in the early 2000s, there was a string of TV adverts for Renault cars with Thierry Henry and the catchphrase "Va va voom," but it always looks like less "va va voom" and more "va va boom." So then, a look at Renault's history as an engine supplier in Formula 1 and the in-out relationship they seem to have with the sport. If this has been an interesting look through the motorsport history books, then do like the video so I know I did a good job. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed with that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever to the fine folk at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help support me at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks down there if you just want to buy me a coffee or a cold drink, and there's also memberships for those that want to support but just want a Patreon alternative. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.